The sky hasn't remembered how to be blue for as long as I can reckon. It hangs now as a bruised, copper ceiling, an unblinking dome the color of old coin and dying embers. Mornings are a thin, hot light that bleeds through a haze of ash and dust. Nights are a low, orange glare that never quite cools. Weather used to be a backdrop. Now it's the antagonist. Wind that scours flesh from bone, heat that cooks the glue out of cities, rain that comes as poisoned water and then stops for years. Where rivers once ran, people drink from cracked bedrock and half-empty reservoirs. Dams sit like fossil bones, their gates welded shut or collapsed, their reservoirs reduced to a skin of mud and rotting timber. The oceans took what they wanted, lowlands, ports, the names we used on maps, and left behind salt flats where highways used to hum. Coastal cities are ragged islands of concrete and rust, their subway tunnels full of silt, and the echo of lives that evaporated. Inland, whole neighborhoods are buried beneath the slow creep of sand, and the skeletal frames of trees that were once proud oaks. The monuments people once climbed to feel small now crouch like war relics, sheared and pitted by years of relentless storms. Heat is the new law. Winters are short and mean. Summers hang on like an insult. Fires run like quicksilver across the hills and swallow suburbs whole, leaving blackened husks and a smell like burned silk. The air tastes of metal and old smoke. We wear scarves not for modesty, but because the dust will settle in your lungs if you give it half a chance. Sunburn is as routine as hunger. Shade has become a luxury item. There are places you used to know and places that used to know you. Grocery stores are mausoleums of smashed glass and rusted freezers. Hospitals are theaters of a kind of abandonment you can't unsee. Beds stripped, syringes left like fossilized offerings, the faint smell of antiseptic folded into the dust. Schools still have chalkboards with lessons half written, the chalk lines hardened by time. City halls and courthouses have become meeting places for those who can't sleep, their flags shredded into banners for makeshift camps. A mailbox might still stand on a bent post with letters never delivered. Occasionally, you find a photograph, curled and faded, someone frozen in a life the world no longer recognizes. Government is a memory that keeps being debated around fires. There are remnants, satellite arrays that still blink at nothing, armored convoys that sometimes move like ghosts across old highways. But central authority bled out when the systems broke. In the vacuum, small sovereignties grew. Survivor enclaves with names like New Meridian, the Basin, the Greenwood, each with its own rules, barter tokens, and punishments. Some cling to the old order, a rusted badge, a uniform patched and worn. Others have become what I call scav havens, loosely organized networks of foragers and traders who move at night. Then there are the raiders, younger, crueler, living by the rule that there's only so much to go around and a hard fist gets it first. Religion flickers in corners. New cults sprout around radios and relics, preaching that the disappearances are divine culling or a test from whatever god people have left. Science survives too, but in pieces. Makeshift labs in basements where people stitch solar panels together from scavenged glass and copper, trying to coax electricity from a broken world. There are researchers who still keep journals, charts of rainfall and temperature, radio logs of transmission windows. They are the quiet heroes forgotten behind the barricades. If you find one, you keep them. Hospitals sometimes function on anxiety and improvisation rather than medicine. Schools run as apprenticeships taught in back alleys. How to filter water, how to read the sky for storms, how to mend a cracked diesel pump. Trade has reverted to smells, coins, and favors. Batteries are worth more than the paper money that sits in a damp drawer and crumbles when you touch it. Clean water is currency, as is fuel, as is knowledge of where to find both. The old institutions, courts, banks, most ministries, exist as empty buildings, their authority eaten away by time and the necessity of survival. In their place are councils and strongmen, A council that meets at dusk under a tarpaulin, a man with a rifle who keeps a road for himself. Laws exist only where someone can enforce them. People have changed. Faces hardened. Laughter grew rare and thin. Children learn to patch boots before they learn their alphabets. There's an economy of shame now. What you can't barter becomes something you hide. Yet in the corners, life persists in ways I'd once thought impossible. A small rooftop garden tended with black market fertilizer. A radio room where someone still spins records to keep the mind human. A theater group that stages plays from memory in the basement of a ruined opera house. Those acts feel obscene sometimes, soft and fragile and wildly dangerous, but they are what keeps us from turning entirely to stone. Scavengers patrol the edges of what remains. They are organized and efficient, reading ruins like a map of pain and profit. They will take anything not bolted down and sometimes things that are. There are also groups who call themselves remnants, people committed to salvaging libraries, archives, anything that holds memory. They risk more than raiders do. They risk hope. They bury books in caches, hide thumb drives in hollowed stones, trade maps for canned food. And then, woven through the geography of this collapse, is the cadence that keeps me awake at night. The cycles. Every 27 years, the radio rooms light with a different static. Every 27 years, families wake to find someone missing, to find a place at the table gone and nothing to explain it. People mark the dates with rituals or fear, depending on temperament. It is a rhythm tied to the world now, an undercurrent to drought and flood, to fires and the dwindling of oil. Whether cause is climate, consequence, or something else entirely, no one has a satisfying answer. Theories paste themselves together from science and superstition, and we cling to both as if either might be the rope that keeps us from falling. This is the world I wake into and broadcast from, a planet unmade and still unmaking itself, a place of jagged survival and small, stubborn humanity. It is not all doom, that would be too tidy, but it is not the world we thought we'd inherit. It's raw, dangerous, and beautiful in the way a wound might be beautiful, horrible, and honest. I tell it not because I want you to pity us, but because the radio needs witnesses. If someone listens on the other end of the static, then the memory of what we were has a chance of surviving the next long, copper-colored dawn. My voice is the thing that keeps me honest. When the microphone is hot and the meter on the console ticks, there's no room for the small lies I tell myself in the dark. I speak into a metal throat that remembers every crack in my voice, and somehow that memory steadies me. People answer back sometimes. Sometimes they don't. Either way, I keep talking. They call me many things depending on who you ask. Broadcaster, chronicler, old fool with a transmitter. But my name is Tomas Rhee. Once before the sky turned copper and the rivers learned to sleep, I was an engineer who fixed things that hummed. Radios, pumps, a generator or two. I built a career off other people's noise. Now I shepherd the last of it. The studio is a room I reclaimed from a collapsed library. Shelves half buried, paper like brittle skin, and a single window framed with a sheet of corrugated metal. I cleaned out a corner and bolted down a folding table. On it sit the console, a battered shortwave set, a hand-cranked generator, and a jar full of toothpick-sized copper wires. There's also a stack of journals, lined notebooks where I write names, dates, and fragments of conversations like offerings to an absent altar. I run transmissions at dawn and dusk, when the ionosphere sometimes listens. I read weather logs and scavenger routes, but mostly I read names. People tell me what they've found, who's missing, and the radio stitches it together into a map of loss. Survival is a long list of small cruelties you learn to accept. I wake before the light bleeds into the sky and walk to the water cache. We store what little we can. Jerrycans buried in shade, rain caught in tarps when it remembers to fall. We filter with charcoal and sand, 3 layers, slow drip, boiled for 10 minutes if the fuel allows. When the firewood runs thin, I burn the cracked pallets we find at old distribution centers. Water is a negotiation. You trade a mechanic's hour for 2 liters, a nurse's bandage for a bucket. I traded my wife's old wedding band once to get a syringe for an old man who could still breathe better with saline. I still think about that trade when sleep is distant. Fuel is another currency. I've learned to siphon diesel from storage tanks and to coax biodiesel from used oil and lye when I have the patience to render it. The pedal generator is my salvation some nights, a contraption of gears and a stubborn drum I spin until my calves burn, enough to trickle charge the batteries that feed the transmitter. Solar panels, when you can find whole ones, are miracles. Broken cells you can wire in series and they cough out a little light. Batteries are the hoarded gold of our time. People will barter a week's worth of canned peaches for a single serviceable 12-volt battery. I keep one under the table wrapped in an old sweater like a live thing. I leave the radio sometimes to make runs. I go into the ruins where scavengers and raiders trade threats instead of pleasantries. You learn to read the city like a weather map, where sunlight falls, where shadows gather, what wind carries sound. I move after dusk, when the heat eases and the coyotes run themselves out. I know how to bypass rusted gates, how to cradle a broken lock until its tumblers remember to turn. I know how to barter a radio tube for a packet of antiseptic. I know how to disappear down a back alley with a cart full of canned beans and come back with fewer teeth in my mouth than I'd left with. Violence is a detail you stop being surprised by. What keeps me going isn't the batteries or the canned food or even the tiny rooftop tomato I coax from composted paper. It's the habit of being the record. There is a rhythm to this world. 27 years, a silence that swallows people. I watched my brother disappear the year it came to our town, gone from the seat at the table, his cup half full, no wound, no trace, only a greasy ring on the table where his hand had been. We marked the date after that, crosses of ash, candles that didn't burn right because the wind took them. After the second cycle, my wife started measuring the windows for cracks only she could see. The third cycle took her. Some nights I wake up reaching for her and feel the absence like a toothache. Her laugh is a radio signal I can't tune back in. I keep an old photograph under duct tape in the console drawer, a woman with a weathered freckled face and a smile that doesn't fit the world anymore. Her name is Mara. Our son, Eli, disappeared the year after her. They went missing in different cycles. I kept telling myself that was mercy, that it couldn't be coincidence. The word coincidence is a warm blanket we used to use to cover the edges of grief. We don't have it anymore. Guilt is a weather system of its own. I survived because I wasn't where they were when it happened. I survived because I had a transistor radio, and later, because I learned how to coax a signal from a dead antenna. I survived because someone taught me how to keep a flame from going out. I survived, and the tally of survival weighs heavy on nights when the generator is quiet. There are faces I dream of, faces that vanish when I reach for them, and those dreams smell of ozone and river mud. I learned to patch myself the way I patch radios. When my hands shake, I wrap them, set a steady rhythm, and breathe. When the sky turns a shade of copper that makes the teeth ache, I go to the roof and listen to the city like a patient. There's a method to keeping hope small and therefore survivable. Cultivate it like a potted thing, fertilize it with chores, prune it with honesty. I teach the neighborhood kids to solder, to make a filter, to read the sky for storms. They ask me to tell them stories from before, and I tell them in fragments. Sunlight on water, cars with roofs, a day when you could call anyone and expect a voice. They believe the parts that sound useful and don't ask about the rest. There are days when I break the rules. I have been angry enough to hand a raider a list of our batteries and watch him throw it in the mud. There are days when I close the console, go out into the orange afternoon, and let the world hit me full in the face until I'm dizzy. But mostly I am disciplined. There is power in routine. I prime the generator, check the valves, tune the receiver, and I read lists into the static because lists are proof. A name said into the open air resists erasure in a small but honest way. Sometimes a voice from 3 towns over answers. "We remember," they will say. Sometimes I get a thin laugh. Once, many months ago, someone sent back a recording of a child singing a lullaby we used to sing in our apartment. The tape is worn, but I have it. I play it when the nights are bitter to remind myself that sound can still belong to comfort. The radio has become a confessional for the lost and the living. People call to confess thefts, to offer warnings, to exchange coordinates for a stash of medical tape. Some call to list names. There's a quiet urgency to those calls. People trying to stitch family trees back together from scattered branches. The remnants, those who hunt for archives and libraries, sometimes find registries and bring them to me. I read names off air. Leela M., born 2001, presumed missing, last seen 2037. Whoever listens might answer. Whoever listens might be a sister who remembers a childhood nickname. The ritual is fragile, but when someone answers, it feels like the world tilts a fraction toward rightness. There is no grand plan in me, no science I'm keeping secret like a power source. I am stubborn in a small way. I document. I teach. I keep a little room warm for the people who pass through and need to rest their hands. Occasionally the radio gathers a crowd. 5, 7 people pressed around a lamp, listening to names and to the weather notes I read out. We clap softly when I finish a transmission, as if applause could anchor people like anchors anchor ships. I make mistakes. I have traded trust for food and lost both. I have misread a storm and watched a garden rot. I have shouted at children for laughing too loud in a place where silence keeps you safe. But I have also found a woman who knits nets from wire and solders the best contacts I've ever seen, and a teenager who can draw maps better than any sat-nav I used to know. We pull together in ways that make me believe, irrationally, stubbornly, that whatever took my family didn't take everything. If you ask me what I want most, I'll tell you 2 things. A morning when the sky looks less like an ember and more like it used to, and an answer for why the cycles happen. I don't believe in simple answers. I do believe in evidence, so I keep logs. I keep the weather charts, the names, the odd frequencies and times when the disappearances spike. One day, maybe, someone with the tools and patience will find a pattern I missed, or maybe no one will. Either way, we must be ready to tell the story. On the air, I keep my voice steady. Off the air, I fold my grief into small tasks. I tend the rooftop tomatoes, I sharpen my knives, I teach someone how to solder. These are my liturgies now. I might be just a voice in the static to you, a crackling at the edge of sleep. But a voice is a thing you can answer back to, and that answering is what makes us less alone. So I will keep speaking. I will keep naming. I will keep the light on for as long as my legs can pedal and my hands can hold a soldering iron. They call it the long dry in conversation, as if naming it softens the cruelty. I call it the thing that takes your time, grinds it down to ash, and then asks for more. The crisis that shaped the years since the second vanishing is not a single beast, but a choir of them. Drought, heat, fire, salt, and storms that come like verdicts. Together they've made the world smaller and meaner. I tell it on the radio because facts are ballast when the wind wants to carry you away. It began as a slow theft. Rain came late. Springs hiccuped and then stopped. The groundwater tables, the ones we used to think of as infinite because we'd never been taught to imagine otherwise, started their long collapse. Wells that had fed neighborhoods shrank to muddy hollows. Rivers that used to cut the land into useful pieces became a string of disconnected pools with the smell of rot in the stagnant water. The sky, once a fickle stranger, turned predictable in its cruelty. Heat, heat, then a storm that brought acid, and then a silence so loud it hummed. The mechanics aren't poetry, they're arithmetic and physics. Heat traps in the atmosphere rose as the air's composition changed. The poles warmed in fits and spurts, upsetting the old flows of wind that used to move weather like clockwork. Jet streams, those long, fast rivers of air high above us, slowed and buckled. Weather systems stalled. Where storms used to move on, they parked themselves over places until those places drowned. Where rains used to come blessedly steady, they now came in violent dumps that washed out what little topsoil we had and then left the land to bake. Oceans, too, warmed and swelled. They took low-lying cities and left behind brine that pushed inland with every angry tide. Salt kills soil. Salt kills hope. Our crops learned the language of defeat. Maize and wheat that once bent in the summer breeze turned to brittle husks. The fungal diseases we'd neglected grew opportunistic in the heat, and what little seed we had was blighted. Farmers turned to greenhouse tarps and raised beds and the prayer of compost. Those methods fed some, but not enough. Food scarcity rewrote laws. What we now call property is whichever hand can hold a jar of pickles. Fires, God the fires. Heat turned forests into kindling. Lightning from storms swollen with static-lit hillsides that burned for weeks and roared like an animal. Smoke stained the sky into that copper I always name. The winds that fed the flames also fed the dust. What little soil there was became dust, and that dust learned to travel. When the dust moves, engines choke, lungs close, and the power you had, mechanical, social, political cracks. And then came the weather anomalies that showed up like punctuation marks around the disappearances. Microbursts of toxic rain, acidic, chemical-laden, washed over the city in gray curtains, and people who were out without shelter ached and coughed for days. Once, a neighborhood downriver tasted the water and went silent for weeks until the tide turned, and the missing were missing no more only by absence. I don't know if the disappearances cause climate change, or if climate change and the disappearances are both symptoms of some larger wound. I only know they happen on the same temper of calendar, and that both make life brutal. Survival got harder because the obvious things that used to help, trade routes, supply chains, governments, fractured. Roads became dangerous patties of salt and glass, and where the asphalt survives, the tracks of raiders. Supply trucks that used to roll with food and medicine learned to travel in convoy and to carry guns. The logistics of keeping a city alive, water treatment, electricity, food procurement, relies on specialized people and systems. When the systems fail and the people are fragmented by fear, the whole thing unravels quickly. A pump without a pump operator is just a rusting memorial. My community is a ring of people who kept the north side of the old river bridge as our boundary. We share a cache, rotate watch, and keep the radio on schedule. But even within that ring there are fractures. Scarcity makes people brittle. Allies become liabilities. Friends become risk calculations. I've traded with a nurse who now runs a clinic out of a gutted pharmacy, and with a mechanic who can rebuild a diesel engine from the bones of 10 others. I've been grateful to both. I've also met men who wear scavenged police patches and use them to claim authority. They take batteries and hand out edicts they think will be obeyed because they have a rifle and a swagger. Raiders took our neighbor's roof garden twice. The first time they came in the middle of night, quiet as sleeping dogs. We lost tomatoes, herbs, and the old woman's rooster. The second time they came with torches. We had to run them off with more noisy courage than sense. Courage can win a scuffle, it doesn't win a drought. After a raid, tongues get sharper. Accusations fly. Did someone trade them information for cigarettes? Did someone leak our stock list? Trust evaporates faster than water. There are also the remnants, people who believe the only way forward is to preserve the archive of what we were. They sneak into libraries and dig out old government ledgers, school rosters, and court records. I work with them sometimes. They bring maps or lists, and I read names into the air. There's a palpable tenderness in that work. Names are the currency of memory. When a voice answers, saying, "Lena O, my sister," what happens in that room is more binding than any treaty. These little recoveries matter. Resource limitations are the day's blunt instrument. Water. We ration it to the point that our hands look permanently dry. I keep a ledger of liters dispensed per person per week. 1.5 liters if the person is lucky, less if we're thin. Baths are an idea, not a practice. You learn to economize water like a miser. Gray water, sink and shower waste, gets funneled into buckets to water plants if it's not too contaminated. We collect rain when it decides to fall in tarps and barrels. We filter with layered cloth, sand, and activated charcoal when we can scrounge the charcoal. Even then we test for smell and color. If it tastes bad, we boil it and hope. Food. Canned goods from abandoned stores are a lifeline and a temptation. Canning jars are as precious as bullets because they preserve food without electricity. We grow in small beds. Beans, leafy greens, things that respond quickly. Protein is the hard currency. Canned fish, dried beans, the occasional goat. Hunting is less reliable now because wildlife is fragmented and often poisonous from runoff and salt. Preserving food means smoking, salting, and sometimes fermenting in jars hidden from marauders. Fuel. Fuel is the heartbeat of whatever motility remains. Diesel will start a generator if you can keep it clean. Gasoline goes off in months unless treated. Solar is a reprieve when panels are whole. You accept the trade. Once you have light, you expose yourself by the glow and the sound of charging that attracts interest. Batteries are stockpiled in hidden caches. We never keep them all in one place. Fuel also powers water pumps and the few remaining refrigeration units that keep medicine viable. Medicine, antibiotics, insulin, clean sutures. These are rarer than kindness. We try to cultivate herbal knowledge, and we barter for antibiotics when someone has a connection to a hidden pharmacy. A septic wound is a death sentence without proper care. Vaccination schedules have gaps, and diseases we once controlled find their chance and spread. The clinic we run is mostly triage and improvisation. We do our best to stop infection with charcoal dressings and to stitch wounds when a surgeon isn't available. Electricity. We have what we can scavenge. The pedal generator works in bursts. We spin it for a half hour to charge the batteries that will let us broadcast names and news for an hour at dawn. Solar arrays we find often have cracked cells. We learn to wire them together in series and accept low yield. We keep one working lantern in the console that makes people's faces look softer and more human during the transmissions. Science in the voice you hear me speak. There are patterns. I measure temperature daily and log barometric pressure. I chart river height and keep a record of storm tracks when we can catch them. The disappearances correlate sometimes with pressure anomalies, times when the barometer plunges and the wind comes in a way I don't trust. I cannot say that such correlations are causation, and yet patterns are the only scaffolding we have to build hypotheses on. The remnant researchers call for more data. That's all we can give them. Numbers read into the air late at night and tucked into notebooks. Actionable things we do because they work. Practicalities that keep a person alive in this geometry of failure. Capture and conserve water. Use tarps and gutters to catch every drop. Build a slow sand filter. A 2-liter bottle with fine gravel, sand, and charcoal will take out some particulates. Boil after filtering if you can. Collect gray water for irrigation, but keep it away from food crops. Make shade. Shade reduces plant stress and lowers human water needs. Old sheets, tarp, a lattice of scavenged wood, all cheap and effective. Plant leafy crops in shade first. Rotate food and seed stores. Use the oldest cans first. Keep seeds dry and cool when possible and label them with dates. Save seed from the plants that survive in your microclimate. They adapt faster than you think. Maintain small-scale power. Learn to solder, maintain connections, and clean corroded contacts. Protect batteries from heat. Store in insulated boxes. Run generators in short bursts and ventilate them. Harden your perimeter without being a brigand. Noise and light attract. Plan runs at dusk. Set listening posts that alert you without exposing you. Trade for if not for arms but for tools. Know your neighbors. A functioning network of people who can lend a hand, a bandage, or an engine part will keep you alive longer than any stockpile. I say these things on air sometimes, because knowledge spreads and one saved life can return a favor you never thought you'd need. Knowledge is safety when the world is a series of collapsing systems. There are moments when things tip fast. A weather front will line up and come in hard, and you have to decide whether to hold the transmitters or to ride the road with a cache. Once a microburst came downriver and filled the old industrial basin with a sloppiness of chemical runoff. The smell hit us first, like a throatful of old lemon. We evacuated the low houses and carried what we could. Some families stayed and paid the slow price. We radioed warnings to the next enclave but didn't know if they'd listen. Tension is the constant companion now. It sits at the table while we eat, a third presence at every discussion. Will we send a scouting party to the pharmacy across the bridge? Will we give away a battery to buy the favor of a strongman with a rifle? All these are ethical decisions grounded in scarcity. Scarcity makes morality a tool, used and shaped by circumstance. The crisis is not a single event. It is the multiplication of small failures until the infrastructure that once supported millions becomes the skeleton under our feet. It's the way a city that could never imagine the end forgets to teach children how to irrigate a bed or fix a pump. It's the way knowledge centralizes until its custodians are gone and the maps are unreadable. It's the way we learn to be cruel because cruelty is efficient, and sometimes the only way to keep a child fed for another month. I keep the logs because I believe we can outthink this if we document it. Charts of temperature spikes, of river lows, of the times disappearances clustered. These are threads someone could someday weave into something that looks like an explanation. And explanations are the scaffolding of hope. When we sit at night after a transmission, lamps guttering, and count the day's losses, there's a small ritual. We name one thing we were grateful for, a button, a neighbor's kindness, the taste of a fresh pea. It keeps the ledger balanced in a human way. The crisis is an unending exam. Every small mercy is a passing grade. We tend what we can, we warn who will listen, and we try to leave a map for the next person who finds the ruins. We are tired and the world is loud with its dying. But in the chest of each person here is a stubbornness that cannot be taxed away. We keep calendars, take readings, and say names into the static. That is our answer to catastrophe. To name, to measure, to remember. It is not a cure. It is a practice of resistance. The dust has a rhythm now, an appetite that chews at everything soft or new. It gets into canned seams, into the threads of our patience, into the tiny crevices where hope hides. When I wake, it is always there, a fine grit in the mouth like memory turned to sand. These days, waking feels less like a beginning and more like preparing for a small defeat. We are running out of the things that keep a community stitched together. Water is the loudest absence. Our ledger, the one I keep in the back of a lined notebook under the transmitter, reads like a litany. 2 liters per adult per day if merciful. 1 if the rain has not visited. 0.5 for those who are sick or extra old when we have to ration deeper. The numbers don't lie, they whisper threats. Last month, after a week with no rain, I had to cut everyone back to 1 liter, which is to say we learned to make peace with thirst. The children get the edge of generosity, always the children, but generosity is a brittle thing. It snaps if you leave it too long in the sun. Food follows like a shadow. Canned goods are a story in themselves. We keep a canning list, rotating stocks, marking dates in black ink. Once a week we do a census of calories. How many cans of fish? How many jars of fruit? How many packs of dried beans? We distribute according to age and contribution, old rules, but that system slows down the quickness with which hunger slices a community. Protein is the thing that creates decisions you don't want to make. Who gets the goat this month? Who keeps it to breed? We used to joke about livestock as legacy. Now we calculate legacies as meals and medicines. Fuel, the oil that makes generators sing and trucks move, has shrunk to the size of a rumor. We keep one working diesel engine in a shed wrapped in oilcloth and prayer. We burn it sparingly. A convoy 3 weeks ago left at dawn and never returned. The track stopped after a mile, and then there were only circles where tires had spun. and an impression of something loud having been dragged away. Raiders are a thing of lore in the way winter used to be a thing of lore. They are also very practical. They take what you can't hide. They learn the sound of your gait and the schedule of your watch. The raids have become more audacious. Where once they moved like wolves, quick, efficient, leaving pain in their wake, they have started to move like storms, overwhelming, impossible to predict. Garrick and his men, a gang that started as opportunists, have learned to build a narrative to go with their theft. They call themselves the new wardens sometimes, as if a name could make theft into governance. Garrick wears a torn municipal patch on his chest, the sort of thing people pick up like talismans, and he speaks with the soft certainty of a man who knows that terror ferments respect. He came through 2 weeks ago and took half of our batteries and a box of antiseptics. He left a note nailed to a post, "Pay for peace, or don't." We put out traps after that, not the deadly kind. No one here wants that, but indicators. Strings tied to cans. A simple bell made of scavenged metal on a thin wire. Anything that makes noise without a human watch. Noise means alert. Light is the same currency. We ran the pedal generator less, hid the solar array behind tarpaulin, and covered the one visible lantern with a sheet at night. We learned to make darkness useful. Darkness is a poor guard, but it is better than being too proud to hide. Those logistical problems are one thing. The other is the human calculus. Scarcity does what scarcity does best. It reveals the true shape of people. Some become kind and precise, offering skills and knowledge like currency. There is Amira, leader of a remnant crew that specializes in old-world plumbing. She can read pipe maps like scripture. She once leaned over my console and traced the wiring with a finger that smelled faintly of solder and river mud. "We can get you clean water," she told me, low and sure, "if you let us open the east sluice at the old mill." Her voice is the kind that makes you imagine a faucet turning. But Amira has deals with men who wear scarves embroidered with teeth. She comes and goes at odd hours with a radio frequency I don't always catch. She brings lists and maps and the kind of hope that feels like a loaded tool. You can use it to fix something, but it also needs a hand strong enough to hold it. Half of the enclave hears her and starts to imagine irrigation pipes, a return to a laugh we haven't had in years. The other half hears a cost. The cost is never made explicit, but it is always there, in the way she talks to Garrick on the side, and in the way she leaves a thermos at dusk without explanation. Then there are the people who burn with belief. Jas, a kid of maybe 14, dark-eyed and quick, thinks Amira is a prophet. He brings me scavenged radio tubes and begs for lessons in soldering. "If there's a spring, Tomas," he tells me, "we can have kids who don't cough in the morning." His faith is thin and bright like the filament of a new bulb. I want to let it be true for him. But the older part of my mind, what's left of engineer Tomas, calculates probabilities and wonders if opening an east sluice in a mill that has been submerged in salt for a decade would be folly. Then the rumor arrives. It starts as most rumors do. A voice on a long wave, a half-remembered remark in a market for barter, a slipped map folded into the lining of a coat. "Blue Spring," they whisper. "The blue spring beneath the old harbor, still running deep." It is the kind of name that makes you think of clear things. Blue water, a joy you can almost taste. It carries with it coordinates on a map torn from a gazetteer and marked with a single pencil cross. Someone swears a patrol found a pipe leading to a desalination chamber whose membranes were untouched. Someone else says the spring is guarded by a community that calls themselves the Keepers, and they trade water for information, and those who know how to read satellite files. I listen to the rumor on air because rumors spread faster than truth, and sometimes truth hides in the middle. I say its name and wait for voices. A thin one answers from the south. "We heard too. There's truth in the tide lines. Someone saw a pump spinning last moon." The voice is high and breathy. Someone else calls in and says it's a trap, people with rifles using the promise of water as bait. A third calls, an old woman with tremors in her speech, who says simply, "If the spring is there, it will be watched. And if it is watched, it means people survive. The debate divides the enclave. Some say we must go. Others chant the old rules. Do not leave the radio unattended. Do not split the guard. Do not move without consensus. The practical side of me, engineer, radio operator, man who knows how to solder a fuse in 30 seconds, calculates needs. One expedition for water. One way to secure a pump or a membrane. One chance to bring back something that could change ration numbers. The moral side of me, the man who had a wife and child and lost them, asks what cost we are willing to pay. For every expedition there is danger, and sometimes the danger is not bullets but weather. A storm could strand a party in a ruined port where tides and salt would finish them. We assemble a small council, the kind of thing that feels ceremonial in a world of scattered authority. Amira with her maps, Nurse Lee who can stitch and knows how to treat burns, 2 men who can drive and have restored engines, myself, and Jas because his fingers are nimble, and maybe because letting him sit this one out would be a cruelty. We argue. Those who are closer to starvation argue for action. Those who have lost more than one family lean toward caution as if caution were somehow an act of love they offer to memory. I set terms. We will go at dusk, when light is thinning. We will bore a frequency, 3 short pulses followed by 2 long, into the console before we leave. A code that means, if we do not return by the 3rd dawn, enact contingency 1. It is not a perfect plan. Plans are not perfect anymore. But plans are something you can hang faith on when the sky is untrustworthy. At dusk, the horizon bleeds copper and the wind wants to take the day's ash with it. We saddle the old truck, its cab patched and its cargo bed full of spare belts. A solar folding blanket, seed packets wrapped in oil. A jerry can of biodiesel that smells like old orange peel and hope. Jas carries the map folded into his chest. Amira carries a satchel of instruments, a hand compass cobbled with magnets, a handheld that reads basic salinity if you have a membrane, little bottles for water samples. Nurse Lee carries a bag of the best bandages we have, the ones we hide underneath the floor. I take the shortwave and bolt the console to the truck with a strap. No sense in leaving the transmitter to the mercy of idle hands. We move out with hearts that are both full and hollow. The road to the harbor is a broken thing, an impression of asphalt and salt. The route skirts the old industrial park where the buildings lean like tired men. We pass the skeleton of the prison and the charred remains of a shopping mall where mannequins stare with faces eaten by time. The truck's tires hiss on the salt. At every bend we listen as if the world might tell us a secret. Nothing waits for us at first but gulls and the smell of ocean made wrong by warmth. Then, a glint, a pipe sticking half out of a tide flat, corroded but unmistakably not a random scrap. The map points true. We find more, valves and conduits running like veins into an ancient plant that sputtered and stopped when the seas swallowed the pumps. Someone, decades before, had tried to keep it going. Someone, maybe, had succeeded enough to keep a chamber breathing. We take water samples. The handheld hums and gives us numbers that are small victories. Salinity lower than the bay, organics within tolerable limits. It is not perfect, but it is a start. The membranes may still work if they have been preserved. We can't fix a membrane with a pocket knife. We need spare parts, filters, power, things we rarely have in the necessary combination. That is the cruel algebra of survival. To bring back something that might save you, you first have to find something that will break trying. That night, as we camp in the hollow of an old breakwater, voices on the shortwave tell us of Garrick's patrols to the north. The radio catches snatches of talk, names, times, threats. Garrick has heard of the Blue Spring too, I think. Word is an attractor, and we are the iron filings. Trust starts to dissolve at the edges. Amira speaks with Garrick by the light of a cigarette, their conversation a choreography I cannot parse. She tells me later that she has friends in his band who can be convinced to trade spare belts for a share of future water. She says the alternative is to leave the membranes alone and let whoever controls the harbor keep them. We cannot be islands, she tells me. We need bridges. Bridges cost things we have little of: confidence, sleep, a willingness to answer to men who would rather take than parley. The internal war in me. Engineer versus man who has lost family, radio operator who wants to keep broadcasting names. Leader who must consider the safety of a community. Carves itself in nights where I cannot find sleep. I dream of a faucet that opens and pours water like promise. I wake with a mouth full of salt. The final weeks before we decide to act are a slow squeezing. Batteries fail. A generator coughs and dies. The rain spool that we thought might come stays away. Food stores shrink. A child in the enclave is diagnosed with an infection we cannot properly treat because the antibiotics were given to another community in trade for seed last season. The moral ledger begins to tilt. Someone suggests quietly, shamefacedly, that we barter our radio for parts. The idea is like seesawing over an abyss. Without the radio, there is no voice to name the missing. Without parts, there is no water to keep us living. That is where hope and necessity collide. The rising action of our story is less a crescendo and more a pressure cooker. We make an expedition to the harbor with the absolute minimum. Enough hands to handle the pumps, instruments to test membranes, fuel to move what we can, and agreements signed in ink and sweat that are fragile but binding. We know the risks. We know the unknowables. We choose anyway. Why do I choose? Why does anyone choose? Because inertia is a slow death, and because the radio has taught me that naming is not enough unless the named can eat. Because Jas's hands are deft, and because Nurse Lee will not watch another child die if there's something she could have done. Because the 27-year rhythm presses on the chest and makes me feel like waiting is a kind of permission to be erased. The tension is not only out there in the fields of salt and rust, it sits inside my ribs, making it hard to swallow. We leave behind watch rotations, a taped note on the console, and one of the small rituals that keep the enclave human. A list of names read into the night before departure, a litany that binds us beyond the horizon. It is an act of defiance, a stitch across the wound of our fear. Whatever we find at the harbor, membranes or a trap, or only the empty echo of a pump, we will bring a story back. That is the small, stubborn thing we believe, that a return story can be seed. That belief, fragile as it is how the rising action breathes. It builds tension not only from outside threats, the raiders, the weather, the failing resources, but from within. The question of whether trust is a currency worth spending, whether hope is folly or necessity, whether the promise of water is salvation or bait. For all the survival tricks I teach on air, slow sand filters, shade-making, battery care, the hardest craft is deciding whom to trust when the stakes are hunger and a child's cough. The most dangerous things are not the storms, but the choices we make in their wake. We head into the harbor at dawn on the third day with grease on our hands, and the map folded so many times its edges are soft. The sky is still that unkind copper. The tension hums like a wire ready to snap. Whatever comes next, ambush, salvation, betrayal, miracle, will not be a singular moment, but the accumulation of every small decision we made leading up to it. The world narrows to a road and the people in the cab, and in the back, a radio wrapped like a talisman. The harbor smelled wrong in a way that made my throat close, salt gone sour, oil and rot airing themselves like old laundry. We came at dawn, engines low, the truck coughing as if it, too, was reluctant to confront whatever the tide had left. The plant crouched before us like a dead machine. Rusted staircases, a control room with its glass spiderwebbed, pumps half out of the ground. Pipes ran into the shallows like veins, leading to something that might still be alive. Amira moved like someone who had memorized the bones of places. She led us past collapsed walkways and into a chamber the sea had spared. The valves were corroded but intact. The membranes, those thin, delicate skins that filter salt from water, hung in a rack like sleeping things. Jas crouched beside them, fingers tracing the edges as if he could coax memory from metal. Nurse Lee had laid out the kit like a surgeon prepping for an unusual operation. Tubes, clamps, a spool of wire, a battered pump motor we prayed would turn. We found a small enclosure with a hand crank and a battery compartment. Someone had tried once to build redundancy into the system. Amira's voice when she said it was low and fierce. It's salvageable. It's old-world tech, but the membranes look intact. If we can power the pump long enough to flush and prime, we might get liters. Not floods, not miracles, but liters. My hands named the parts before I let my heart hope. I ran my fingers along the rust and felt, to my engineer's superstition, the texture of possibility. The handheld salinity meter blinked back numbers, and I watched them as though they might tell me a prayer. They were promising, low enough to imagine a filter working. We had parts, maybe. We had grease and wire and a man who could make a belt where none should be. We lacked, of course, the holy trifecta: steady power, secure perimeter, and time. Time is the cruelest variable because it comes in storms. I remember the way the horizon darkened while we were still rigging a temporary line, the sky folding into an angry metal that I'd learned to read for bad news. We worked faster. Jas tightened clamps until his knuckles bled. Amira coaxed the motor with a spanner like coaxing life. I strapped the battery from our truck into the pumps compartment and felt my stomach drop at what that meant. That battery was the one I kept for the console, the one that kept the voice on air. If it died here, the radio would go cold. Names would stop being named. For a moment I felt the old calculus: one battery, two possible uses. Do you keep the voice, or do you power the pump that could bring water and maybe keep 5 families alive another month? We didn't have time for philosophy. The pump jerked, coughed, then turned, sending a hesitant pulse through the ancient membrane. Water thin, smelling faintly of brine and metal, dribbled into the collector. A cheer bubbled up from the men with grease on their hands, a sound like a child discovering a light on in a dark house. I felt something unclench in my chest. We had something. That cheering was drowned by the sound of a shout and the slap of heavy boots on corroded metal. Garrick's men had tracked us. Word travels fast when the promise of water lives on the wind. The raiders moved like a shadow across the plant's walkways, voices ricocheting. Blue Spring, one of them called, and then a laugh that needed no translation. We should have expected it. The harbor was an exposed place, and promises are magnets for desperate hands. I had hoped our timing, arriving as the pump came awake, would let us slip back with what we could. I had not expected Garrick to bring more than threats. Negotiation was useless. Garrick stepped into the light with the barrel of a rifle on his hip and the municipal patch on his chest, and he spoke like a man angling to be king. He claimed stewardship. He recited rules he did not make himself, and he wanted the membranes. Water keeps people calm, he said, and calm keeps you from making hard choices. He wanted to turn the pump to his advantage, to make the keepers sell water for obedience. Amira's face set like an old valve. She refused. She refused so completely that Garrick smirked, took a step forward, and signaled the men behind him. Where negotiation had broken, something else filled the space. A pressure that condensed into violence. A fight started, sudden and ugly, metal on metal, a shout, the cry of someone struck. Jas dove behind a conduit and Nurse Lee moved to pull him out. A raider swung a metal bar and it glanced off a pipe, ringing like a bell. I remember the small arithmetic of that moment. A pump, a battery, a radio. And then I remember a hand, the sleeve of Amira's jacket, reaching for a valve and me thinking I was late to everything in my life. The valve was stiff, grams of effort, a push here, a twist there. Amira turned it and something like water and light happened. The filter flushed and the collector filled faster, a clear stream that shone in the dim like a promise kept. And then without warning she vanished. Her hand was at the valve when it happened. One heartbeat she was there, hair caught in her scarf, jaw set, and the next there was where she had been. A gap, a smear, a scent of ozone like after lightning. The valve kept turning, unguided for a breath, and then slowed as if someone else had lent it a hand. Jas screamed something that took over his throat and made him sound like a thing I'd never heard him say. For a second I thought it was a trick, a rag pulled into the dark. Then Yah's palm closed on empty air, and his fingers came away with a thin, dusty residue. You develop a vocabulary for loss when you live like this, but there is no verb for watching someone cease to be present. She did not fall. She did not stumble. She simply was not there, as if some seam in the world had been snipped and the piece had been taken away. My first, stupid thought was that the railings had collapsed, that she had slipped into something salvageable. My second was a recall of the 27-year rhythm that had taken my wife and my son. The rhythm, the calendar, the cycles that turned like a grim metronome. People shouted. Garrick raised his gun not at us, but at the empty spot where the woman had been. He barked orders, and then, seeing the pump coming to life and the water spilling clean into the collector, he moved with a new ambition, to seize what the moment offered. A man on his side lunged for the battery as if it were a thing that might pull the tide in his favor. We tangled for a breath, screams. A lamp toppled and guttered. Someone cursed that it had been lighted. Time bent. I think every decision I have ever been afraid to make compressed into the space between a shout and the smell of wet metal. I could run for the truck and get the second battery, a spare we had hidden in the axle, or I could keep my hands where they were and hold the line while Jas and the others finished priming the system. If I left, the pump might die and Garrick would have what he wanted. If I stayed, we might hold the water but lose other things. Lives, limbs, the radio. The radio, in its small, stubborn way, felt like a living tether to what I had been and who we were. Without it, names would stop being named. I thought of my wife's photograph under duct tape, of the list of missing people in my journal, lines that made the absence resistant to erasure. The idea of surrendering the battery that powered the transmitter made my mouth go dry. But the water already flowed, and people were looking at it with a hunger that could rationalize anything. I acted like an engineer who understood probabilities and obligations at the same time. I shouted a code, 3 short pulses, too long, over the console into the air, not to call someone in, but because contracts are better kept when heard. Then, with a hands-on speed that comes from using the same tool until it lives in your muscles, I unhooked our console battery and strapped it into the pump. The radio went dark in my hands. The meters on the console died like the last breath of a small animal. Silence took on a new and immediate shape. It wasn't the quiet of absence. It was the active quiet of something being taken away. Jas lunged, eyes wide, and it was all I could do to hold on to him. Nurse Lee swore, and someone hit Garrick with the butt of his rifle. The raiders faltered when the pump began to sing properly, and water poured in a small cascade into containers we had lowered. For a minute, just a minute, we had water and the world felt like it might tilt back toward justice. But the cost had been paid up front. My voice was gone from the open air. The console sat mute, and I felt, surprising and heavy, as if the world had cut a cord from my chest. I had traded the ability to call names in the present for the ability to save lives in the immediate. It felt like a necessary arithmetic and an obscene one. We loaded what we could carry, drums and jerry cans, bottles, cloth sacks for filtration later. Garrick cursed and took his men away when the cost of staying seemed greater than the prize. Maybe he thought us spent. Maybe he thought a different tide would bring a richer pickings. He left us bruised and breathless and clutching our small, stolen wealth. He left us with the knowledge that someone else had wanted what we had found. In the truck on the return road, water sloshing beneath tarps, Jas leaned his head on my shoulder and cried. No quiet, no measured grief, only raw sound. We all were quiet after that. The enclave received us like pilgrims who had touched a relic. We distributed liters as if they were teeth, metering out mercy in grams and spoons. We brewed broth and soaked bandages, and people drank, and made faces like something in their mouths had been returned. And yet absence pressed on. Amira's spot at the edge of the group was empty in a way you cannot fix. People offered theories, kidnapping, an engineered removal, an effect of being too close to whatever the blue spring was, but none of them fit what I had seen. A hand at a valve, then simply nothing. The pattern of the 27-year cycle wrapped itself around my throat with slow fingers. I felt, foolishly and with a kind of new clarity, that my exchange at the pump had weight beyond the immediate. I had killed my broadcast in order to feed a moment. I had traded names for water. I had traded the voice that stitched absence into sentences for the very thing that might let someone survive to be named at all. That night I found my console under the tarp and sat with it in the dim. The meters glowed faintly from residual charge. The dial that used to hum with background noise was a dead eye. I took Mara's photograph from the drawer and let my thumb trace her face. I thought of the way the world takes, and the way it sometimes gives back in a small, impossible trickle. The climax was not one event but a braided thing. The pump coming awake, Amira disappearing, Garrick's raid, my decision to power one life-saving machine with the battery that kept a voice on the air. It resolved into water in drums and an enclave that slept with lighter chests, and into an absence we could not fill with anything but question. In the days that followed, the pump continued to cough and spit clean water in measured bursts. We learned to ration with a wisdom born of the cliff we'd seen. The radio stayed dark. People asked why. I told them the truth in pieces, and in the gaps between pieces they stitched rumors. Some called me a traitor, and some called me a savior. I felt like a man who had done what he could and watched the universe answer with mystery. And the cycle hummed on. The vanishing had taken a woman who might have been the key to more than the pump. Perhaps it had taken the person who knew the maps we needed to make the system permanent. Perhaps the spring would be ours for now. Or perhaps Garrick would return with more men, and other people would vanish in his wake. The stakes were broader than the jar of water we now guarded. The turning point left us with water and a new ledger of costs. I had sacrificed the voice to feed the body, and I did not know if I had done right. In a world where choices are sharp and consequences wide, sometimes the only path is forward. I held on to the drum with both hands and prayed that the names I had stopped saying would, one day, be spoken again, by someone who found a way to keep both pumps running and radios singing. Until then, we would drink and remember and keep watch, because that is the thing people who have been taken from know best, to survive, and to keep another evening's light for the living. When we drove back over the broken bridge, the truck felt lighter and heavier at the same time. The drums sloshed like a nervous animal. The men in the cab were quiet as if we'd all swallowed something we could not name. We came back with water, enough to steady gasps and mend a fever, enough to give grain seed a chance in a trough, and an old man the luxury of washing his hands for the first time in months. That kind of return changes you the way a good sleep changes a bruise. It doesn't make it go away, but it makes tomorrow feel less lethal. The immediate outcome of my choice was simple. We had water and we had no voice. The battery I'd taken from the console gave the pump the pulse it needed, and for a while, the harbor coughed up clean liters like a reluctant generosity. We filled drums, jerry cans, and whatever plastic bottles people could press into service. We made lines that looked like ration lines, but with less anger than I expected. People treated the litters with a tenderness I hadn't seen in too long. Someone cried when the first child drank without grimacing at the taste. It looked like someone rediscovering a small human mercy, but the cost sat like ash on my tongue. The console in my studio sat dark as a tomb. Some mornings I would sit before it and watch the needles while they did not move, and in the emptiness I could hear every name I had not spoken, the sound of their absence and answering echo. In the enclave, voices split. Some called me cunning, pragmatic. Others called me a traitor to the ritual that naming had become. "You took our voice," an old man told me, eyes bright with accusation. "You took what makes us human." Another woman said, "You kept us alive. A voice alone does not feed a child." Both were true and both hurt. Amira's absence made everything more raw. People tried to dress the whole with explanations. Garrick's men had been the obvious suspect, and in the first days some wanted to hunt. go find him and make him name what he had done. Others feared that attempting reprisal would cost more lives. We agreed to patrol and watch. We repaired fences with old metal and planted noise traps along the usual approaches. But you can't fence a calendar. The 27-year rhythm, whatever it was, didn't care about cordon and search. It took people in ways we could not predict or bulletproof. Jas, who had been small and urgent that day, grew overnight into a kind of quiet man. The harbor had stiffened him in a good way. His hands, once eager on radio tubes, now learned pumps and clamps. He helped me bring drums across the bridge and taught younger kids to patch leaks. Nurse Lee stayed close to him and taught him how to stitch without gagging when the wound smelled badly. The community shifted on its axis toward care and maintenance. We set up a schedule to run the pump on a ration circuit. We taught 3 people how to check membrane integrity. We found a way to rig a hand crank so the system could limp on without batteries if need be. Nature did not suddenly repent. The rain stayed thin and erratic. The fields did not heal overnight. But I noticed small things that felt like courage. Moss grew in the shaded seams of a wall that had been bone dry. A stubborn rooftop patch of beans pushed up new leaves. Birds, thin and cautious, returned in small numbers to a reed bed that had been a mudflat. Those are not profound recoveries. They are the economy of small victories. The world was still falling apart, but here and there its breathing seemed less labored. My own breathing was worse. I found myself measuring decisions on a scale I had not known I'd been carrying. Did I act for the present life or for the ritual of memory? Was keeping the voice sacred more important than stopping a child from dying of thirst? In the quiet hours, I would take Mara's photograph out and feel the warmth of the taped corner. I had been a man who had learned to make things work. I had been a man who had trusted that names mattered because they kept the missing from dissolving into statistics. That belief did not perish when I powered the pump. It complicated, sharpened. Naming mattered, and so did having hands to hold a jar of water. We tried to rebuild the radio the way you fix a bone, stitch the pieces and keep them immobile until they knit. We scavenged for batteries in abandoned cars and in the lockers of a convoy that had not come back. The remnants found salvage. A solar panel tucked in a greenhouse someone had thought too insignificant to take. A battery cell half intact in the back of a derelict ambulance. It was not enough to make the station hum again, but it was enough to give me the technical hope that we could bring it back. My notebooks, whether logs, barometric readings, lists of missing, grew thicker, collated now with the pump's maintenance schedule. I would read names aloud in the communal tent at night with a soft voice that was not broadcast, but intended for ears that needed to hear. It was a small consolation ritual, an attempt to keep the thread alive until we had enough charge to speak to someone beyond our valley. The moral argument never left the table. People argued into the night about the decision. Some argued that the radio had been a luxury, a pet project for a man who could not let go of the past. Others said that without the voice we had become less than we were, reduced to survival animals who could not claim their dead by name. My own feeling was a complicated private ache. I had chosen lives over liturgy that day, and I could not say with certainty that I had done right. What I could say with certainty was that water, once in people's stomachs, changes arguments. A child who can sleep because she is not aching from thirst is less likely to be sacrificed in the calculus of scarcity. That practical truth kept me upright when guilt wanted me to sink. We tried to guard the pump. Garrick and his band did not return immediately. Perhaps he had richer pickings elsewhere, or perhaps he feared starved people who now had the taste of water. But we understood that our gain painted a target on our backs. We started to talk about making alliances with neighboring enclaves, trading water for cooperation or technology. That felt like a compromise. We would risk exposure to leverage the resource into a network of mutual defense. The younger men wanted to bolster fighting forces. The elders wanted covenants and written agreements. I found myself learning to be a broker in ways I had never imagined, negotiating terms, promising parts we did not yet have, writing the word trust on paper and daring people to sign it. Scientifically, the data remained stubbornly incomplete. The remnant researchers took samples and found what we had first thought: salinity within tolerable ranges, organics that could be reduced with charcoal and time. They prepared a plan to try to replicate the membrane and to find a way of powering it without surrendering the radio for long stretches. There were suggestions of desalination by hand crank for emergencies. There were sketches of wind catchers to charge small cells. It felt like the beginning of engineering hope, small, modular solutions that could be shared and taught, not hoarded like some arcane sovereignty. But the calendar kept turning. The 27-year rhythm closed like a fist around our community's chest. Anniversaries of previous vanishings were met now with heightened watchfulness. We lit fewer candles and relied more on sensors and listening posts. The remnants tried to correlate the times of disappearance with barometric anomalies and with unusual radio noise. They found correlations but not reasons. The absence of a reason became a new kind of pressure. People do better with villains than with mysteries. A villain you can fight has a clarity that a mystery does not. Perhaps the most honest thing I can say about the aftermath is this: we bought time, not an answer. The water gives the enclave months, maybe a year, of breathing space if we are careful. It allows children to eat protein-rich meals, keeps infections from starting in the same way, and gives our gardeners a window to try a more ambitious bed. It also raises the stakes. A resource that once was hypothetical now needs protection, maintenance, and most dangerously, politics. Inside me, something shifted from a private chronicler into a public steward. Before, my ledger of names was for memory's sake. Now my ledger included plumbing schedules, ration lists, and patrol rotations. I found a new rhythm in the mundane tasks: teaching a boy to solder, coaching a woman to check a valve seal, showing Nurse Lee how to rig suction for a clogged line. These were prosaic acts, but in them I felt an extension of naming. Giving people skills is another way of saying their existence matters. At night, I still dream of the empty space where Amira had been. Sometimes in those dreams, I hear the quiet tick of a console that won't wake. Sometimes I imagine a future where the radio sings, and the pump runs on solar and hand energy, and the 27-year rhythm is understood enough that people stop being taken. Those are not guarantees. They are, however, the scaffolding of stubbornness. We survive by stitching together practical solutions and by keeping a ledger of hope. So the aftermath is not victory nor defeat, but a prolonged, necessary work. We shifted from one mode of survival to another, from naming to maintenance, then to negotiation, and back to naming again. I learned that heroism in this world is often not a single sacrifice, but a long series of small, unglamorous choices that accumulate into something like resilience. My hands, still smelling of oil and river salt, learned to be comfortable with that kind of quiet work. We will try to restore the voice. We will try to guard the pump and teach its care. We will try to hold the line between being generous and being exploited. We will continue to log temperatures, river heights, and anomalies, because numbers are the only language stubborn enough to wrestle truth from chaos. I do not know if the world is healing. I only know that in a small enclave, under a sky that still looks like embers, people drank clear water and slept in a way that felt like hope. That is not a tidy ending. It is not meant to be. It is the slow folding of events into memory and plan, the falling action of choices that will reverberate. I made a decision that saved mouths and silenced a voice. I will live with that arithmetic and keep turning the pages in my notebook. If one day the radio sings again, I will read names into the air and then go fix a pump. Both acts will be necessary. Both acts will be human. There is a shape to the way endings arrive in a world like ours. Not as a single curtain, but as a series of small closings, doors latched against wind, conversations that stop mid-sentence, stations that go dark and then flicker back to life. Sitting under the patched tarpaulin with a drum of harbor water beside me and a silent console waiting for parts, I can feel that shape. We have bought a margin of time. We have not bought an ending. The trade I made at the pump, battery for water, voice for life, will follow me like a shadow. There are nights when I wake and the silence of the console is louder than any storm. I miss the ritual of naming on the air. I miss the tiny, stubborn chorus of other voices in the static. But when I look at the sleeping village and see children with cleaner throats, old men who can take a wash without coughing for hours afterward, I know I was not making a choice between deliverable absolutes. I was balancing immediate needs against a future we must still make. Hope here is not cinematic. It is a lid of loose soil that, if you keep it moist and shelter it from the wind, will sprout a stubborn thing. We have coaxed seedlings out of rooftop beds. We have taught 3 people to check membrane integrity, and 2 more to solder a connection that will not arc and burn. Jas has become dependable in the sort of way that used to be reserved for weather reports, predictable and quiet. Nurse Lee has taught half the enclave how to pack a wound to buy time. The remnants have mapped other possible salvage points. These small, practical advances feel like victories that the world understands, small and stubborn and useful. That does not mean we are naive. Garrick's shadow is still long. The 27-year rhythm is still a metronome I can hear beneath sleep. The disappearance of Amira is a wound that will not close with bandage or ration. There are nights when I think of her hand on the valve, and the way she smiled at the pump like it was a child that had finally remembered how to breathe. I think of what we lost when she vanished, and I listen for patterns in the air with a sharper ear. We are learning, painfully and patiently, how to turn salvage into sustainability. The immediate plan is practical. Teach more hands to run the pump without the battery. Build communal schedules so the water lasts. Cultivate alliances with neighboring enclaves so we can share burden and defense. And little by little, scavenge pieces to bring the console back to life. The remnants believe that if we can combine manual desalination techniques with modular power, hand cranks, wind catchers, small solar arrays, we can reduce the need to gamble our voice for short-term survival. It is engineering hope on a human scale. I keep my notebooks and I keep reading the numbers into the small room at night. Temperatures, barometric dips, times when the disappearances clustered, data as ritual. I do it because a log is more than evidence. It is an argument against erasure. When someone asks whether knowing changes anything, I say, maybe not today, but maybe tomorrow someone with a patient mind and the right tools will see in those numbers what we could not. That is how science and story are the same here. They both require witnesses. If there is one thing I want to leave anyone who hears this, whoever you are, wherever you might be hiding under a ripped tarp or in the bones of an old cathedral, it is this. Do not let the small things go. Teach a child to solder. Hide a seed packet. Mark a name in a book and keep that book dry. Build a hand crank. Learn to read the sky. Share what you can without making every favor a ledger. Keep a list and read it aloud. The smallest acts are the scaffolding of survival. I also ask, no, I plead, that you keep your radio alive in whatever way you can. If you cannot broadcast broadly, read names into your local circle. Naming somebody resists the way absence tries to make us forget. Names are not vanity, they are anchor points. When someone answers a name, the universe tilts a fraction back toward rightness. When you speak a name, you refuse to let the person dissolve into the arithmetic of loss. That refusal matters. We are practical people now. We are also stubbornly human. We still tell stories after a long day hauling water. We still manage a small theater in a basement that reenacts old films. We still sing because sound is stubborn medicine. These things are not frivolous. They are the heartwork that keeps us from hardening into the type of being that survives, but does not remember to be kind. Do not mistake this for optimism without teeth. I know what cruelty the world can deliver. I know the way hunger bends decisions and the way fear can make people act like beasts. I also know that cruelty does not have a monopoly on behavior. Neighbors help neighbors, strangers trade spare parts for skills, and people risk themselves for people who matter to them. That coalition of tiny mercies is our operating system now. So the future I choose to work toward is not a grand reconstruction or a naive promise of green fields. It is a horizon defined by incremental gains, a repaired console that sings names again, a set of spare membrane parts that keep the desalination system breathing, a network of enclaves that stand by each other when Garrick's men test their appetite. It is children who can measure rainfall and hinge a valve, and elders who can be consulted to keep memory honest. It is, in the smallest measure, the continuity between one day and the next, stitched together by people who refuse to let loss be the final verb. If you are listening and you are alone, find a garden patch, find a manual, find someone with practiced hands and keep names. If you are with others, teach them to fix things and to forgive themselves when they cannot. If you have batteries, offer them to someone who can convert them into a pump or a transmitter depending on need. Do not make a pantheon of hoarding. Hoarding kills communities faster than storms do. My last message is less an order than a promise. I will keep the ledger. I will keep the water from going to waste. I will teach someone to solder so the radio can sing again. I will keep reading names into the quiet. And when we have the power, I will say them on the air so that those at the edge of listening will know they were remembered. I do not know if these acts will save us from whatever pattern takes people in cycles, nor do I know if the world will tilt back to what it was. But I know this: life demands work, and hope is a craft that can be practiced. Stay alive. Keep your hands busy. Name people out loud. Teach someone to make a pump from a bent axle. Make a schedule for water and for sleep. Love the small things that do not ask for anything in return. We will wake tomorrow and the day after that, and we will decide again. There is no grand rescue on the horizon, only a long, unromantic accumulation of small mercies. If we keep at them, maybe those mercies will become something like a future.